Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sharpening Report. Well, we have a weird one for you today, but I think it's going to be very interesting, and we're going to learn some cool stuff. Have you ever heard of the Chronicles of Jerahmeel? Well, I was watching a few years ago. I was watching a Q&A video from my good friend Dr. Ken Johnson, and somebody had asked him about this text that I had never heard about before, called the Chronicles of Jeremiel, or it's probably Jeremiel or something. Now, from what I remember, and it's been quite a while, so forgive me if I'm not remembering it exactly correctly, but Ken didn't immediately dismiss it, but he wasn't really familiar with it either, so that got me intrigued. And I opened my internet browser on my phone, I did a quick search, found the text, and saved that window for a future time. Well, today I actually have 63 windows like that saved on my phone, so it's been quite a while. But a short time back, I had some spare time, and I wanted to see what that very first window I had saved was, because I had completely forgot. So I saw it was the Chronicles of Jeremiel. So I thought it'd finally be time to do a study into this strange, weird text. So what is it? First off, I want to make it very clear this is not a part of the Bible, should not be part of the Bible. You should not get any kind of biblical insight from this. What this is, but it's historically really interesting. It's a collection of extended biblical events, Roman history, lists of geographical names and genealogies. It contains texts about the creation to the death of Judas Maccabeus. Moses Gaster translated it into English in 1899. He believed the Chronicles were compiled from Hebrew sources, both ancient and medieval. The actual compiler of the Chronicles identifies himself as Eliezer ben Asher the Levite, who, according to Gaster, lived in the Rhineland in the 14th century. It's called the Chronicles of Jeremiel because, as Gaster explains, Eliezer was just the compiler, while Jeremiel is the source most reproduced. He's identified as Jeremiel ben Solomon, thought to have lived in Italy around 1150 AD. So what most people want to know, is this real? Well, here's some excerpts from the preface that was written by the translator himself. Quote, "The present volume contains a collection of old world legends and tales. The heroes are mostly biblical personages, hence the name given to it by me, Bible Historiale. It resembles in tendency and spirit these medieval compilations and is their oldest representative. The Hebrew text exists only in one single manuscript. My translation is as faithful and literal as rendering as such a subject requires. Unlike others, I have followed the older example and have added a full index. It is a complete digest of the whole matter contained in the book. No incident of any importance has willfully been omitted. In a long introduction, I have investigated firstly the question as to the date and authorship of the Chronicle as a whole. In the second part of the introduction, I have studied each chapter and each text separately, and I have minutely investigated each paragraph and smaller incident. 5 pages of the Hebrew manuscript of decisive importance for the date and for the original character of this compilation have been added. In short, no pains have been spared to make this book a worthy contribution to the study of biblical apocrypha and to place in the hand of the student the means of testing the truth and cogency of the conclusions to which I have arrived." End quote. So it appears that, yes, these manuscripts are real in the sense that they weren't forgeries. But we must keep in mind that we must keep in mind that because this was compiled in the Middle Ages, we got to keep an eye out for any influences of the time, and there's quite a bit. Also, like with any study like this, if we see anything that conflicts with the Bible, we do not incorporate that source into our Christian faith. And lastly, we must remember that this is a compilation, not just one document, so it's possible some parts teach good theology while others do not, and we wouldn't necessarily have to throw the entire thing out because of that, but we also wouldn't want to just accept the entire thing either. Now, the introduction from the translator is very long, so I won't go into all of it because I know you're all here for the same reason. You want to know what's in the text, especially the weird stuff. And that's what got me excited about it too, so I won't make you wait too long for that. But there are some important things worth mentioning from the introduction. So he starts out by saying, quote, "The chronicle which I publish here for the first time is not a chronicle in the strict sense of the word. It does not relate true events which have happened in the history of mankind, but it belongs more to that class of legendary history which was so much in vogue in the Middle Ages, and which owes its original conception to the attempt from very ancient times to embellish the biblical narrative. The history of the world began with the narrative of the Bible, first for the Jews and then for all the nations who have derived their knowledge and their faith from the same source," end quote. So it's good to know while we read through the text that it was popular in the Middle Ages to embellish certain things, and you're going to see a lot of that. So we shouldn't read this in the same way that we would read biblical texts. He also says, quote, "Greater activity was displayed in the production of the so-called pseudepigraphical books such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and a host of other similar productions which have the Bible as their center, a poetic imagination as their characteristic. A true appreciation of this literature has been reserved for our times. These books were used in the composition of the medieval Bible Historiale, a term the translator has put on the Chronicles of Jeremiel. But not one single text, according to the common notion, has been preserved in its original language," end quote. Now, it's important to keep in mind, he wrote this in 1899, and at that time the Dead Sea Scrolls had not been discovered yet. So he's being cautious with these texts. Now, as we found out, though, the copies of books like Enoch and Jubilees that existed were very close to the original text found within the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the last thing that we'll look at, he says, quote, "It is furthermore incomprehensible that for no visible reason, writers of a later period should have so successfully avoided adopting the current literary language of their time, and I have purposely written in that pure, simple biblical form. I do not suggest that this alone is a stringent proof of antiquity, but at any rate, I wish to point out that at no time do we know this literary canon to have been established or to have been acted upon that writers should imitate the diction of the Bible. The language, therefore, is no proof whatsoever of the recent origin of this or any such book. Internal evidence alone must finally decide the true character and date of each composition." So basically, he's just saying that, just because some of the text might contain medieval language, that doesn't mean that the text couldn't have been copied from something older and that the copier or translator just used more modern language to his time. We even do this a lot with a lot of our Bible translations, even just from the King James Version to the New King James Version. Both are the Bible and both are fairly accurate, but one modernizes the language a little bit more to help the reader understand it better. So he's saying, you have to take each text for itself to determine when and where it was written. Okay, so that's enough of the introduction. Let's get into some of the text here. Now, obviously, this is a huge text, and we won't be able to go through it exhaustively, so we're just going to focus on the first 9 or 10 chapters or so that deal with everything before and after creation. We won't be able to get into everything, but there are some interesting things I want to at least point out. And if you want this study to continue, after this video, leave me a comment and let me know that you want to, because after this part, all of the creation stuff, after that it talks about what hell is like, then after that it talks about what heaven is like, and I could see doing, more videos on this if there's a want for it, if you guys want it, so let me know. Okay, so let's just start out right at the beginning. It says, quote, "Before the world was created, God in his name alone existed. When it entered his mind to create the world, he drew the plan of a world, but it would not stand. This may be compared to the action of a man who wishes to build a palace. Unless he plans out its foundations, its exits, and its entrances, he cannot commence to build. Thus, God planned the world before him, but it would not stand until he created repentance. 7 things were created prior to the creation of the world: the law, repentance, the throne of glory, the Garden of Eden, Gehinnom, which is like Gehenna, hell, the site of the temple, and the name of the Messiah, and for all these things proof is to be found in the scriptures, end quote. Now, you might automatically be thinking, well, this is saying the Messiah was created. We got to throw this whole thing out. No, it doesn't say that. It says the name of the Messiah. Now, I don't have the original language of this text, so when it says name, I don't know if that's referring to just the literal earthly name of Yeshua, or if it means name as in how the name of God is often used in the Bible to denote God's personality or his power or his authority. If it's just an earthly name, then this doesn't really bother me. However, if it means any of the other things, obviously those attributes of God and Jesus were never created and were pre-existent to everything else. So at that point, I would, if it is meaning that, I would say this text is in error. But right now, we just don't know. It then goes on to talk about what was created on each day of creation. So, for example, the second day is interesting. It says 8 things were also created on the second day: the well of Miriam, manna, the rod of Moses, the rainbow, the letters and the writing, the clothes of Adam and Eve, and demons, Mazakim. Now, a couple of things here. First, it really feels like the rainbow was created in Genesis after the flood. Now, while I suppose they could make a case that God only put it there for a sign, but it existed before as like a natural process, I don't know of anything actually supporting that argument. And then second, I guess maybe one could try to make that case, but I'm not buying it personally. Another thing in there. If by clothes of Adam and Eve, if the writer means generally just the processes and materials of the natural world that would one day become their clothes, then maybe, but your mind probably went right to where my mind went. If he's meaning the actual clothes that God made for them when they sinned, well, we know that that's not true. That wasn't created before the world, because those came from a living animal at the time of the fall. So that wasn't created on the second day, unless again, you could make a weird case that maybe. But and then third from this, it's highly unlikely that demons were created on the second day or directly created by God at all in that way. God created man and God created angels, and according to Genesis, angels sinned against God by mating with humans. Then the product of that were the giants, Nephilim. Then the Book of Enoch explains that when the giants died, their spirits were the demons that we know today. Like that, they're basically ghosts of Nephilim. I find that to be a pretty likely explanation. That makes sense to me. So I don't think that demons were created on the second day in the way that the Chronicles of Jeremiel says. So next we get a description of God's throne. Quote, "His footstool is like fire and hail, and beneath the throne of glory it has the appearance of sapphires. Fire plays round about it. Righteousness and justice are the supports of his throne. Clouds of glory surround it, and the wheel, the ophon, the cherub, and the holy creatures sing praises unto him. The throne is like sapphire. It stands upon 4 legs, and 4 holy creatures are attached to it. On each side are 4 faces and 4 wings, and it is said, there were 4 faces, which were 4 angels. When he speaks from the east, from between the 2 cherubim, he speaks in the direction of the face of man. When he speaks from the south, he speaks in the direction of the face of the lion. When he speaks from the west, he speaks in the direction of the oxen. When from the north, in the direction of the eagle. And opposite him are the Ophanim and the wheels of the chariot. When he sits upon the throne, high and exalted, and looks around the earth, his chariot being upon wheels, though the noise caused by the wheels of the chariot, lightnings and earthquakes are caused in the world." End quote. Now, that to me just sounds really cool. And of course, we see elements of Ezekiel's vision and stuff from the Book of Enoch as well in here. And I think that's where we'll conclude chapter 1. So to show how some of the mythological stuff really comes into play in some of these descriptions, let's skip ahead a little bit and let's take a look at chapter 3, verse 1, which says, quote, "On the 4th day he formed 2 lights, one not larger than the other. They were identical both in their form and in their light. As it is said, and God made the 2 lights. A quarrel ensued between them. One said to the other, I am greater than thou. Therefore God, in order to make peace between them, enlarged the one and diminished the other, as it is said, and the greater to rule by day. Now, we read that today and we think, wow, that's pretty silly. Of course, it is by how we understand our modern literature, but back in medieval times, this kind of thing was popular, this way of describing things. So what's being said here? Well, most likely it's just a story, nothing more. There's a possibility that this is alluding to some connections that we see in the Bible between stars and angels. But really, in the Bible, the furthest you could logically take it is that either stars represent angels, or that at most, maybe each angel is responsible or assigned to a physical star. But even that is tough to prove based on just the Bible alone. But even then, the Bible doesn't say that when you look up at the sky and you see all those stars that you're actually seeing angels themselves. And even if that were the case, certainly the sun and moon aren't angels. But even if they were, why would they be arguing about who's greater, and how does that not result in the sin of pride? So clearly, this isn't a literal account of how the creation of the sun and moon were actually created. It's most likely just a mythological story used to accentuate a specific point that the writer was trying to make. What's the point? Most likely that no matter how powerful the sun and moon seems to be, they're still below God, and God ultimately decides what they will be doing. And you see this in a lot of biblical polemics and stuff like that as well. So let's go through chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 1, which this is only actually 2 verses, so it's not very much. But let's read through this. On the 5th day, he brought forth from the waters all manner of winged birds, male and female, all manner of locusts, and also the Leviathan, a serpent, which holds all the dwellers of the lower waters beneath his 2 fins. The center of the earth rests upon the huge serpents, which form food for the Leviathan. Every day he opens his mouth, and a huge serpent comes every day to feed him. It flies and flutters and enters the mouth of Leviathan, while God sports with it, as it is said, Thou hast created this Leviathan to sport with it. On the 6th day, he brought forth from the earth all kinds of animals, male and female, and the behemoth that lies on 1,000 hills, from which it obtains its food every day. In the nighttime the food grows again, as if the hills had not been touched. As it is said, its food is from the produce of the mountains, and it drinks from the waters of the Jordan. For the waters of the Jordan encompass all the land of Israel, 1/2 of which is above, and the other of which is below the earth, as it is said, for he can draw up the Jordan in his mouth. The behemoth is preserved for the day on which it is to be brought as a sacrifice on the occasion of the great banquet of the righteous. As it is said, its maker will approach it with his sword. I got a lot to say about this. This is really interesting to me, because Leviathan is mentioned in the book of Job, and I've done a lot of study into what Leviathan is. Same with Behemoth. While and by the way, if you guys want like a long study on that, let me know. I'll do a video on it. But while this description is obviously embellished with more of that medieval mythology, there's a small kernel of truth to it. Leviathan is the spiritual agent of chaos in the Bible, and in my opinion, it is Leviathan who is the beast from the sea in Revelation, or at least it's using that as a picture. And again, if you'd like me to do a deep dive into Leviathan and Behemoth in a different video, let me know, and I'll be sure to do that. Now, what's also interesting is that it says Behemoth will be brought as a sacrifice on the occasion of the great banquet of the righteous. I'm curious out there how many of you have ever heard of this. There was an ancient Jewish belief that Leviathan and Behemoth would both be served as food at the end times banquet, which we Christians today would call the marriage supper of the Lamb. We can find information about this from extra biblical sources. 1 Enoch 60:24 says, quote, 2 monsters prepared according to the greatness of the Lord will provide food for the chosen and the righteous, end quote. 4th Ezra 6:52 says Behemoth and Leviathan have been kept in order to quote, be eaten by whom thou God wilt and when thou wilt, end quote. Second Baruch 29:4 says, quote, Behemoth will be revealed from his place, and Leviathan will also arise from the sea, and then they will be food for all who remain, end quote. And we also see this reflected in the Targums, which are ancient Jewish Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, but with extra commentary added that were written in the rabbinic period between the 1st and 7th centuries. Targum on Psalm 104:25 through 26 says, quote, this is the sea, great and wide of boundaries, where there are creeping things without number, beasts both small and great. There the ships go, and as for Leviathan, that you created to sport at the banquet of the righteous, it is his dwelling house. All of them look to you to give their food in due season. Then we have Targum of the Canticles 8:2 says, quote, I will lead you, O King Messiah. I will bring you up into my temple, and you will teach me to fear the Lord and to walk in his ways. There we will partake of the feast of Leviathan, and we will drink from old wine which has been preserved in its grapes from the day that the world was created, and from pomegranates and fruits which are prepared for the righteous in the Garden of Eden, end quote. Now, one last note on this before we move on. The book of Ezekiel seems to be saying something similar, yet it's not us who will be feasting on Leviathan, but the beasts and the birds of the earth. So Ezekiel 29:3-5 says, look, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great monster laying in the midst of its waterways, who has said, my Nile is my own, I made it for myself. I will put hooks in your jaws and stick the fish of your waterways to your scales. I will haul you up from the midst of your waterways, and all the fish of your waterways will stick to your scales. I will leave you in the wilderness, you and all the fish of your waterways, and you will fall in the open field and will not be gathered up or collected. I have given you as food to the beasts of the earth and the birds of the skies. Now, there are other examples of this, like Ezekiel 32:3-4 and Ezekiel 39:17-19. Now, we do know from the book of Revelation that there will be a marriage supper of the Lamb, but there will also be a feast for the birds and animals of the dead soldiers, kings, and princes who tried to come against Jesus when he returns. So the Ezekiel passage could be combining these two ideas, and God is saying to Pharaoh, not Leviathan, that he will be food for the animals, yet is using Leviathan imagery because that's the spirit that Pharaoh was most attached to, perhaps. Much in the same way that Ezekiel speaks out against the king of Tyre, but there's a lot in there about Satan himself, yet the language seems to meld these two together. So something like that could be going on here. Okay, let's now move on to chapter 6, verse 10 of the Chronicles of Jeremiel. There are points in here where you can tell the writer was trying to answer questions about the Bible that people had in his own time. So, for example, how long was Adam and Eve on earth before the fall? Did it take centuries or decades, years, months, days? How long did it take for Eve to eat the fruit? While the Bible doesn't explicitly tell us, the writer of the Chronicles of Jeremiel attempts to provide an answer. Quote, there are 12 hours in the day. In the first hour, he gathered the dust for man. In the second, he hardened it. In the third, he shaped it in the form of a man. In the fourth, the soul was thrust into it. In the fifth, man stood on his legs. In the sixth, he gave names to all the birds and animals. In the seventh, Eve was joined to him. In the eighth, they produced 2 children. In the ninth, they were commanded concerning the fruits of the trees. In the 10th, he transgressed the command. In the 11th, he was judged. In the 12th hour, he was driven out, as it is said, and he drove Adam out of the Garden of Eden, end quote. Well, that is a really busy 12 hours. Is this possible? As a concept, sure. I mean, you can't produce 2 children in 1 hour, unless it's only talking about conception. And I would highly doubt naming all the birds and animals could be done in 1 hour. But just as a vague concept, could they have been there for that short amount of time? Sure, it's just as possible as years or centuries. But we must keep in mind that this text is not authoritative and it is not giving us gospel truth here. This is what the writer thinks about the matter. So the writer's trying to answer this question, how long were Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall? So yes, an interesting theory, and it could be true, at least some elements, but it doesn't necessarily, conflict with the account in Genesis, as far as I'm aware, but it is only that, an interesting theory and kind of a far off one with some of those hours. Now the next part is, wow, we flew through that pretty fast. Let me see where we're at here. Okay. Well, the next part is about the formation of the body and the soul. It's trying to answer the question of if we were in heaven before we were born. And it has a lot to say about that. And I mean, that's something that we wonder today, too. Were we in heaven before we were born? I'm going to give my opinion on it. I'm going to read what the writer has to say before that, though. However, this is the end of the free section of the sharpening report. So to get the rest of this episode, head on over to dailyrenegade.com and sign up for a membership. It is only $10 a month or $100 a year, and I highly recommend getting the yearly plan because you technically get 2 months for free with that plan. Also makes great Christmas gifts if you want to get it for a family member. So go ahead and head on over to dailyrenegade.com, and get your membership today, and we'll see you over there for the rest of the episode. There's a lot more to get through. If you are already a member watching on dailyrenegade.com, just hold on the line and we'll get to the rest. And to everyone else watching for free, thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, take care and God bless. Concerning the economically unstable times that we live in, it is a great idea to convert some of your savings into real money. Now, there is a big difference between real money and what we call money, which is actually just currency. So our dollar is currency, which fluctuates. Real money, on the other hand, like silver, for example, is a store of value over time. The best way to think of it is like this. If you had saved $1,000 in cash back in the late 60s, the late 1960s, that $1,000 would still be $1,000 technically, but it would buy you significantly less today due to inflation. Now, if you had saved that same $1,000 in silver back in the 1960s, today it would be worth around $28,000. So one of the best ways to protect your purchasing power is in real money, more specifically, silver. You can buy and have the metal shipped discreetly to your door, and what most people don't know is that you can actually convert your IRA or even a 401k into physical silver rather than having all of your life savings tied up in the paper fiat system, which is subject to hyperinflation. Go to dailyrenegade.com and click on the Cornerstone Assets Metals banner. This is the only company that I personally trust with this kind of thing. Click on that and sign up to get your free silver report today. One of the financial experts will speak with you to find out the best way to protect your savings going forward in these uncertain times.